When we think about serial killers, we think about the likes of Jeffrey Dahmer, who went to such extremes in his warped version of loneliness that he cannibalized parts of his victims' bodies. Or we think about Ted Bundy going on a rampage and murdering innocent young women. But serial killers come in all shapes and sizes of every demographic. We saw just yesterday, as I record this, the conviction of the British nurse who looks very meek and very innocent, Lucy Letby, who was found guilty, finally, after an 8-month trial and 110 hours of jury deliberations. She was found guilty of murdering 7 little babies and attempting to murder a further 6. But female serial killers have existed throughout history. And in this video, we're going to talk about another killer nurse. Well, she was a nurse. She didn't kill patients, though. She killed members of her own family. This is the story of Mary Ann Cotton. Hello everyone and welcome to episode 28 of Crime Stories Sunday. So it hasn't been a Crime Stories Sunday for a while. I used to do them weekly. I no longer do them weekly because they take a lot of research and time is a finite resource, sadly. So today we are talking about the female serial killer from the 19th century, Mary Ann Cotton. Mary Ann Cotton is the name that she's most well known by and the name that she had when she was executed. But she was actually born Mary Ann Robson. She was born on Halloween, 1832. What an appropriate day for such an evil woman to be born. She was born in Low Moseley, which is a few miles from the city of Sunderland in the northeast of England. And in the 19th century, well, all the way up to the later part of the 20th century, the northeast of England was coal mining country. The majority of the men who lived there in the surrounding district were coal miners, as was Mary Ann Cotton's father, Michael. So Mary Ann was born to Michael and to her mother, Margaret. Her sister, Margaret, was born a couple of years later, but she only lived a few months. In those days, it was actually really common for children to die in infancy. My own great-grandparents had 13 children, but only 7 survived into adulthood. Her brother Robert was born just a year later in 1835, and he survived. When Mary Ann was 8, her family moved to the mining village of Merton, which is about 19-20 miles away from her birthplace. And that's where she grew up, Merton Village. Her family were religious, and Mary, along with her brother, attended Sunday school. Apparently, her childhood Sunday school superintendent described her as most exemplary and a regular attender. A girl of innocent disposition and average intelligence. She took pride in her appearance. There was nothing, apparently, in her childhood that would predict what she was to become. Shortly after the move to Merton Village, Mary Ann's father fell 150 feet to his death down a mining shaft at Merton Colliery in 1842. Sources say that her father's body was delivered to her mother for burial in a sack bearing the stamp property of South Hetton Coal Company. Sadly, because they lived in a miner's cottage that was for miners, after Michael's death, there was no longer a place for the Robson family and they were evicted. Just a year later, though, her mother remarried to someone called George Stott, who was also a miner. And we know very little else about Mary's childhood. At the age of 16, she left home to become a nurse in the nearby village of South Hetton. Apparently, she had a stint as a dressmaker, but in her adult life, she worked on and off as a nurse, caring for people in the community. Yet what she was doing behind closed doors was nothing short of evil. So we need to talk about Mary Ann Cotton's husbands. Husband number one was William Mowbray. In 1852, when she was 20 years old, she married William, who was a colliery labourer at Newcastle upon Tyne. They then moved to the southwest of England for, hopefully, a better life. At Mary Ann's trial, years later, there were reports of 4 or 5 of their children dying young while they were living in the southwest. However, none of these deaths are registered. And although registration was compulsory at that time, compulsory registration of births and deaths came in England in 1832, I believe. But none of these deaths were registered. So how the court got hold of this information, presumably it had to be hearsay. So I don't know. I mean, maybe they did have 4 or 5 babies that died very young, and when babies died at birth, sometimes they weren't registered, to be honest. We just don't know. Although it was compulsory, there was nothing in the statute that punished people for not registering babies. That only became enforceable in 1874. The only birth recorded was that of their daughter Margaret Jane, who was born in 1856. After a few years in the southwest, William and Mary Ann moved back to the northeast of England, where William worked as a fireman aboard a steam vessel sailing out of Sunderland. And then he worked as a colliery foreman at the local pit. Another daughter, Isabella, was born in 1858. But sadly, the firstborn, Mary Jane, died in 1860. Another daughter, also named Margaret Jane, was born in 1861. And this is something that people used to do in the 19th century. I've seen this in census records of my own family genealogy research, that if they had a child that died, sometimes they give the next child of the same gender the same name. Then they had a son who was unusually, for the time, given 3 names: John Robert William, who was born in 1863. But sadly, he died at the age of 1 from apparently gastric fever. William died of an intestinal disorder in 1865. Just a year after their son, John Robert William, had died of gastric fever. So let's keep a note of how these people are dying, shall we? The lives of William and their children were insured. So they all had life insurance. Mary Ann collected a payout of £35 on William's death, which is equivalent to about £3,500 as of around now. It was about half a year's wages for a manual labourer at the time. And then £2.05 for John Robert William. Okay, she moved to Seaham Harbour, where she struck up a relationship with someone else called Joseph Nattrass. During this time, her 3.5-year-old daughter died of typhus, which is a fever that was rampant in the 19th century. So, if we're totting all of these child deaths up, it left her with just 1 child. She returned to Sunderland and took up employment at the Sunderland Infirmary, House of Recovery for the cure of contagious fevers. And she worked there as a nurse. And she sent a surviving child, Isabella, to live with her mother. So maybe she didn't like children very much, or maybe because she was working, she didn't have the time to look after Isabella. We don't know. But Isabella went to live with her mother. Now, while she was in this relationship with someone called Joseph, she met an engineer who was called George Ward, who was one of her patients in the infirmary. She didn't kill him while he was there as a patient, They married on the 28th of August, 1865. George continued to suffer from the ill health that he'd had that put him in the hospital in the first place. And sadly, he died on the 20th of October, 1866. So just over a year after him and Mary Ann were married. It was a long illness characterised by paralysis and intestinal problems. The cause of death recorded on his death certificate is that of cholera and typhoid. The attending doctor later gave evidence that Ward had been very ill, yet he'd been surprised at how sudden his death was, given that he was chronically ill, and then suddenly he just dropped dead. Once again, Mary Ann collected insurance money. And then we bring in husband number 3, who was someone called James Robinson. James Robinson was a shipwright in Sunderland, whose first wife, Hannah, had recently died. And he hired Mary Ann as a housekeeper in November 1866. So just a month after husband number 2 had died, she became acquainted with James Robinson. A month later, James's baby, John, died of gastric fever. Are we noticing how all of these people seem to be dying of gastric problems? Keep that in mind. Little baby John, who was Hannah's child, who Mary Ann was employed to care for as part of her housekeeping duties. And James was inconsolable at this death, and he turned to his housekeeper, Mary Ann, for solace and comfort. And she became pregnant. Being pregnant out of wedlock was a big deal in those days. So Mary Ann is pregnant with James Robinson's baby. And around that time, Mary Ann's mother became ill with hepatitis. And Mary Ann went to stay with her to nurse her. And although her mother began to recover, she also began to complain of stomach pains. And she died at the age of 54 in the spring of 1867, just 9 days after Mary Ann's arrival. So Mary Ann's daughter, who had been living with her grandma, now after her grandma died, she came back to live with Mary Ann and back to the Robinson household. So James Robinson and Mary Ann became an item, and they did eventually marry on the 11th of August 1867. However, Isabella, who had been a healthy child up to this point, also developed severe stomach pains. Who'd have thought? And she died as well. And then James Robinson's children from his first wife, Hannah, also developed stomach pains and also died. And all of these 3 children were buried in the last week of April and the first week of May in 1867, shortly before James and Mary Ann married. Mary Ann received a life insurance payout of £5 and 10 shillings for Isabella. So, pregnant Mary Ann had her first child with James. She was a little girl, and they called her Margaret, after Mary Ann's mother, Isabella, after the child Isabella that had just recently died. Sadly, though, this little baby also became ill and died in February of 1868. They then had another child called George, who was born in June of 1869. Now, James Robinson was no fool, and he started to become suspicious of all of these people who were dropping dead of stomach pains all around Mary Ann. Her children, her stepchildren, her mother, her husbands. This was surely not a coincidence, thought James Robinson, and perhaps he was right. He became suspicious of Mary Ann collecting these life insurance policies. He was upset and disturbed when Mary Ann kept badgering him to get his own life insured. At the same time of his growing suspicions about Mary Ann potentially being a murderer here, He also discovered that she'd been living beyond her means, and she'd run up debts of £60 behind his back and had stolen more than £50 that she was hoping to use to pay off these debts. Then he found out that Mary Ann had been forcing his surviving older children, again, children that were born of his first wife, Hannah, she was forcing them to go and pawn household valuables. So he got fed up of her and he threw her out. So this guy was not stupid. He threw her out and kept his life. And he also retained custody of their mutual son, George. So potentially they're saving his and George's lives. But Mary Ann was unfazed by this change in her life circumstances. And she married husband number 4, who's Frederick Cotton. So this is where she gets the Cotton name from. She was desperate at this point, living on the streets. And then her friend, Margaret Cotton, took pity on her and introduced her to her brother, Frederick, who was a pitman who'd been recently widowed. He was somebody who needed consoling and comfort. He'd lost his wife, and he'd also lost 2 of his 4 children to illnesses. So he's living there, desperate, in need of support. So his sister, well-meaning, introduced him to Mary Ann. And she became a housekeeper and a substitute mother to the remaining 2 children, Frederick Jr. and Charles. But sadly, in 1870, Margaret Cotton died of some kind of stomach ailment, leaving Mary Ann to console her brother Frederick to her heart's content. Soon she became pregnant, and Frederick Cotton and Mary Ann were bigamously married in September 1870 in Newcastle upon Tyne, because she was still married to James Robinson. She'd never divorced from James. He threw her out, but she was still married to him because she hadn't bumped him off. He threw her out. But that was unfazing to Mary Ann. She didn't care. She married bigamously. And their son Robert was born in early 1871. Soon after this, Mary Ann learnt that her former lover, remember him, Joseph, was living just 30 miles away and was no longer married. She travelled to see him, this lover, and she rekindled her romance and persuaded her new family, Frederick Cotton, to move nearer to him. Oh dear, though. Oh dear. Frederick Cotton then just suddenly dropped dead of quote-unquote gastric fever. She collected the life insurance on his life. So after Frederick's death, Joseph moved in with Mary Ann, and she gained employment as a nurse for people who were recovering from smallpox, which was an epidemic at the time. Soon, Mary became pregnant by him with what is probably her 13th child. And then her son with Frederick Sr., Frederick Jr., died in March of 1872. And then the little baby Robert also died soon after. Then Joseph, her lover, became ill with gastric fever and died. What are the odds of all of these people over now several years dying of gastric fever or undetermined stomach complaints? What are the odds? What are the odds? Now, this is where Mary Ann's downfall began. She'd been getting away with this for years. These people just dropping dead around her. Nobody had questioned it. The only person who becomes suspicious was James Robinson, the husband who had the good sense to throw her out. There was a parish official called Thomas Riley who asked her to help nurse a woman who had become ill with smallpox. Mary Ann complained that her surviving son, Charles, was in the way, and she asked Thomas Riley if he could be committed to the local workhouse. Now, look, guys, you did not want to go to a 19th century workhouse. They were not nice places. But Mary Ann, she just didn't care. She just wanted to get rid of this boy. She told Riley that the boy was sickly and added, "I won't be troubled long. He'll go like the rest of all the Cottons." 5 days later, this boy, the sickly boy, Charles, died. And Thomas Riley went to the police and he convinced a local doctor to delay writing a death certificate until the circumstances could undergo a full police investigation. Mary Ann's first visit after Charles's death was not to the doctor to get the death certificate, but to the insurance office to claim her quote-unquote winnings. Sadly, though, she discovered that no money would be paid out until the insurance company got the death certificate. But an investigation and an inquest was held, and the jury returned a verdict of natural causes. So Mary got away with it and said that Thomas Riley had made unfair allegations against her because she rejected his romantic advances. And the jury believed her. You know, this little woman who'd had all this unfortunate circumstances happen to her, the jury of this inquest believed her. But local news reporters latched onto the story and they started to dig. You know, we're all diggers, aren't we? You know, us internet sleuths. Well, in the 19th century, reporters, people from the local community also did their fair share of sleuthing. And they started to pick apart Mary Ann's life and realised that she'd lost 3 husbands, a lover, a friend, her mother, and probably up to 11 children who'd all died of stomach fevers. So the local papers started to run with this story. And all of these rumours gave rise to the police looking into this and thinking, hold on a minute, these sleuths might be onto something. And the rumour gave rise to a full scientific investigation. Dr. William Byers Kilburn, who'd attended to the dead child Charles, had kept samples and he sent them for testing. And the testing showed that these samples, like blood samples, tissue samples, contained the poison arsenic, he told the police, who arrested Mary Ann. They exhumed the child Charles's body and found that his body was full of arsenic, and she was charged with his murder. However, the trial had to be delayed because Mary Ann was pregnant. She was pregnant with her possibly 13th and final child, who she called Margaret Edith. And Margaret Edith was born in Durham Jail on the 7th of January, 1873. Mary Ann sat in jail for a couple of months, and her trial began at Durham Court on the 5th of March, 1873. The defence in the case was handled by someone called Thomas Campbell Foster, who argued during the trial that Charles had died from inhaling arsenic used as a dye in the wallpaper of the Cotton home. Another theory that Campbell Foster put forward to the jury was that Mary Ann might have bought some powder but was given the wrong one by the chemist. She might have gone to buy bismuth powder, which was used at the time to treat stomach complaints, diarrhea and things like that. And the chemist made a mistake and gave her arsenic instead. And that's why the child had so much arsenic in his body. You know, this was an attempt to put reasonable doubt into the jury's mind. But unfortunately for Mary Ann, they only deliberated for 90 minutes and came back with a guilty verdict. The Times on the 20th of March reported, after conviction, the wretched woman exhibited strong emotion, but this gave place in a few hours to her habitual cold, reserved demeanour, and she staunchly asserts her innocent of the crime that she's been convicted of. But she was hanged on the 24th of March 1873. Unfortunately for Mary Ann, the hanging went wrong, so instead of her neck breaking, her death came from a long, slow strangulation caused by the rope being rigged too short, possibly deliberately. The Newcastle Chronicle called her a monster in human shape. After her death, Northeast children would recite a chilling nursery rhyme. Sing, sing, oh what can I sing? Mary Ann Cotton is tied up with string. Where, up in the air, selling black puddings, a penny a pair. Now, over 100 years later, in the 1990s, when Durham Jail was being modernised, the graves of some of those executed in the 19th century were disturbed, including that of Mary Ann Cotton. And interestingly, a pair of shoes belonging to her were found along with her bones. The bodies of these executed criminals were removed from the worksite and were all later cremated. And there endeth the story of Mary Ann Cotton, the pretty young woman who became cold and hard, and everyone around her just died of gastric problems. So although she was only convicted of one murder, one that they could prove, it's very likely that all of these people around her, her husbands, her children, her friend, what are the odds that they'd all die of stomach problems? What does arsenic poisoning cause? It causes an illness that looks very much like gastric fever. All right, guys, let me know your thoughts on this horrible case in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye, guys.